Nixon is an extremely smart man. He is one of the ablest, shrewdest, most disingenuous, and slipperiest politicians that ever showed up on the American scene. Again, I repeat, this is 1958 when I was saying this. He can sit in Washington one night and convince some of the most modern Republicans that he is the best ball carrier they have, and spend 4 hours in the Waldorf Towers the next day convincing MacArthur and Herbert Hoover that he is their man. He can use the tremendously overrated and overpublicized, but actually highly cautious part he played in the Alger Hiss exposure to hang on to the hopeful loyalty of the vigorous anti-communists at the very time when he is insinuating himself into the good graces of the left by quietly knifing McCarthy. Nixon could pose as a conservative Republican congressman and yet be, as he was, right at the time when he's running for the Senate and being elected to the Senate as this incredibly conservative anti-communist, he was one of the original founders in 1950 of Republican Advance. Now, Republican Advance was intended to be not only the Republican parallel to, not the opposition to, but the Republican parallel to, the Republican teammate of Americans for Democratic Action, and to help to steer the Republican Party down exactly the same path that the ADA was steering and trying to steer the Democratic Party. But they even had interlocking left-wingers who were members of both groups to be sure that they were kept down the same straight line. And two of the founders of Republican Advance were Richard Nixon and Christian Herter. Nixon can claim still to be vigorously anti-communist, yet when he has a chance as vice president to break the tie and cast the decisive vote for H.R. 3, to reestablish some chance of prosecution of subversives actually advocating violent overthrow of our government, what happens? All he had to do was cast his vote. It was one for the anti-communist conservative side. Instead, he moves heaven and earth to have Wallace Bennett found and pressured into voting against H.R. 3, which Nixon himself didn't dare do and go on record as doing, thus defeating the measure so that the vice president would not have to vote at all. What good would such a man be to us, even as president, unless outside forces and accomplishments made it opportunistic and expedient for him to ride an anti-communist wave which those outside forces had created? As for being a leader, the sad truth, hard for many hopeful and wishful conservative Republicans to realize, is that Richard Nixon, a most engaging personality and clever politician, has never been a leader in connection with any event or development or at any stage in his career. He has been a rider of waves, so far as public support was concerned, without caring whether the particular wave at any given time was moving left or right, and he has been a manipulator of uncanny skill behind the scenes. I will ask you before the next sentence to remember that this was originally in 1958 given to an all-male audience. There were 11 men, no ladies. Because my next sentence is, Nixon always brings to my mind the old gag that a wife is a person who helps you to get over all the troubles you wouldn't have had if you hadn't got married. Or the somewhat more elegant version that diplomats help us to solve our problems that never would have arisen if there had not been any diplomats. But for the dirtiest deal in American political history, participated in, if not actually engineered by Richard Nixon, in order to make himself vice president and to put Warren on the Supreme Court as part of that deal, Taft would have been nominated at Chicago in 1952. It is almost certain that Taft would then have been elected president by a far greater plurality than was Eisenhower, that a grand rout of the communists in our government and in our midst would have been started, that McCarthy would be alive today, and that we wouldn't even be in this mess that we are supposed to look to Nixon to lead us out of. And in appraising Richard Nixon's character, nobody should overlook the vicious undercover knifing of Bill Nolan by Nixon's men in California in the campaign just finished, fall of '58. And this is not surmise, gentlemen, but definite fact, observed at first hand by stalwart Republicans in California, some of whom were personal friends of Nixon, and at first just could not believe what they were seeing. They came to believe it all right, for Nixon was determined to get rid of Nolan once and for all and at any cost as a possible contender for control of the California delegation and for the nomination in 1960. This despite the fact that from the day Nixon landed in Washington as a freshman congressman, nobody had been nicer to him or helped him in more ways than the well-loved senator from his own state, Bill Nolan. Then I said, now please do not project my remarks about Nixon beyond their intended purpose. He may be the best bet we have for the Republican standard-bearer in 1960 who has any chance of getting the nomination. He would be far better than Nelson Rockefeller. For while I think Nixon would ride any wave to the right or left that seemed likely to carry him farthest, I don't think Nixon would be committed to personally helping to make the wave go left, as I think Nelson Rockefeller would be. I think Nixon could become a very patriotic anti-communist if we could create circumstances in which it would be smart politics to be one. Whereas I think Nelson Rockefeller would fight for further movement towards the internationalist left under any and all circumstances. I think Nelson Rockefeller is definitely committed to trying to make the United States a part of a one-world socialist government, while I don't think Nixon is committed to anything other than the career of Richard Nixon. In that, he is neither better nor worse than most other politicians, merely smarter.